In our last segment, we talked all about the parts of the contract documents. In this segment, we're going to talk about one of the most fundamental purposes of the contract documents, and that is the scope of work. This is really what contract documents are meant to be, purely identifying and defining the scope of work and clearly communicating that scope. The scope of work is formal documentation that clearly defines what is to be done in a project, how it will be done, when it should be finished, and who is responsible. The goal is for all parties to have a clear, aligned vision. The intent here is to remove any ambiguity and clearly define for everybody what is to be done. The scope of work defines what is included, what is excluded, and who is responsible. If you think about most of the components of the contract documents that we talked about in the last section, a lot of them are basically ways to clearly define the scope of work or to go back and clarify it where the contract documents may have been lacking. The contract, that's essentially outlining the parameters of the project, what is to be done, an overall schedule, and agreements on costs. The drawings, well, those are like a pictorial instruction manual for how a building is meant to be built and what the project work should entail. The specifications, those describe how this work should be done. Each of these documents should clearly convey to the contractor what they are to do and how they're to do it. The other items, RFIs, change orders, and addendums, those are mechanisms to clarify something when those other documents are not clear. An RFI, remember that's a request for information. Basically, there's a discrepancy or missing information that the contractor needs to do their work. An addendum will alter some part of the contract drawings to revise the scope of work. And a change order, that will change the contractor's scope due to some unforeseen conditions. Addenda occur before the contract is executed, while change orders are after the work has begun. Those items are an attempt to clarify, define, or revise the scope of work. So the primary purpose of the contract documents is to clearly communicate the scope of work to the contractors. When the scope is unclear, projects rely on RFIs, change orders, and assumptions, which can add a lot of time, money, and headaches to a project, not to mention disputes, finger-pointing, and sometimes lawsuits. The scope of work must be communicated clearly through the drawings and specifications. It's our job, no matter which role we play in a project, to make sure we understand and are conveying the scope properly. No one person is responsible for the entirety of the contract documents, but everyone plays a part. At the beginning of your career, our responsibility isn't going to be about defining the scope of work, but to recognize it, interpret it, and make sure we're operating within that scope. The scope of work, it's everything in our line of work. Poor scope communication is the root cause of most project problems. It's not an annoyance, it's the main problem in construction projects. If the scope is unclear, everything else breaks down. No one is perfect and everyone makes mistakes, but a project plagued by huge numbers of RFIs and change orders, that's when the really uncomfortable conversations start happening. And you know what? They're almost always scope discussions and misunderstandings about who's supposed to do what. It's like playing a board game. If we can't agree on the rules of the game, or we aren't playing by the same rules, and we don't know what the objective is, no one's going to win and no one's going to be happy. So how do we learn how to do it right? When you start in this industry, you usually don't have these big discussions. You get to work making drawings and you feel a little bit like you're working in a drawing factory. You're churning out projects. It's hard to zoom out and see the forest for the trees and understand how the work you're doing fits into the larger project. Maybe no one's ever explained to you the whole concept of what we're talking about today, but drawings are instructions to contractors and installers. They're supposed to tell a story. Their job is not to just look good, although that certainly helps make the instructions clear, but what's on them has to clearly communicate the story that we're trying to tell. When we're putting together drawings and writing those notes to convey our scope, remember, scope requires two things: a noun, what the item is, and a verb, what is being done to it. Clearly and succinctly, we should be describing what needs to be done, carefully choosing our words to say precisely what we mean, no more, no less, and without leaving it up for interpretation. It seems so simple, but I've been working my whole career trying to be succinct. So let's go through some examples to illustrate what we mean. Say you're working on a set of drawings and your supervisor tells you to identify the standpipe in the stairwell. How should you do that? So you can start by putting a tag standpipe, pointing it to the standpipe in the stairwell. That's not incorrect, but it really doesn't tell a story at all. Yes, there's a standpipe in the stair, but is it existing or is it new? What size? What type is it? Is the standpipe in the scope or is it out of the scope? Is it affected by the work being done in this project? Let's try existing 6-inch manual wet standpipe in stairwell with fire hose valve 4 feet above finished floor. Well, that note goes a long way to describe the standpipe now, but still, are we touching it as part of the scope? If I am, do I need to know what class and type the standpipe is? I could add the phrase to remain, and if the contractor is expecting to alter it in some way, maybe I'll specify that it's a Class 1 manual wet standpipe. Other than words, there are other tools at our disposal to communicate work. Things like line weights can make a distinction between work that's existing to be demolished and new. Other drafting items like hatch patterns and scope boxes can help convey areas of work and convey scope. But they don't mean anything if we don't define these parameters and what they mean and use them consistently across the project to communicate effectively. And these are only tools in our toolbox. They're only as good as the intent behind them. Another example, say you're working on a small fit-out project, altering the existing sprinkler system in a building to account for new walls and floors. The lead designer is reviewing your drawings and tells you to indicate the floor control valve. Great, you put an FCV tag at the location that you remember seeing it in your site visit. That FCV tag, did you define it somewhere in a legend, what that abbreviation means? For FCV, it may be obvious, but FP, that can mean anything. That can mean fire protection, fire pump, fire panel, floor plan, foundation plan, or federal project. Sure, some of these don't make sense depending on context, but still, we want to be as clear as possible to avoid any miscommunication. So back to our floor control valve. All right, so we tagged it, but that doesn't really convey any scope. It identifies an object, but it doesn't define responsibility. Is it an existing one shown for reference, or is the contractor providing a new one? And which contractor? The note needs to provide direction. Tell the contractor if it's in their scope or not, and if so, what they need to do with it. What action is required? Examples of good scope notes include existing 4-inch floor control valves shown for reference, not in scope. Or, contractor to provide new floor control valve for 6th floor system, monitoring to be provided by fire alarm contractor. That last bit is also important, distinguishing between contractors. If the work is shown on sprinkler plans, it could be inferred that it's their scope of work, but there will naturally be some coordination that has to happen between the sprinkler contractor and the fire alarm contractor, since all valves controlling the water supply need to be monitored by the fire alarm system. So while I'm here on my scope soapbox, if you haven't heard this advice yet, avoid the term by others. It's a trap. Who is others? Is it the owner, the general contractor, or the mechanical contractor? Who knows? In order to communicate the scope effectively, nothing should be left so open-ended. If we don't name the other, then we haven't defined the scope. The last item we need to cover when it comes to scope of work is to understand what's not in the scope of work. That's what's referred to as scope creep. Scope creep happens when work expands beyond what was clearly defined in the original documents. If work is not clearly defined at the start, it's not possible to know where it ends. Scope creep may take a few different forms. Let's take an example. Maybe you've been asked to produce drawings for a fit-out, but you don't have any as-builts and you didn't get a chance to go to the site to do a survey. So you put in your old standby note, coordinate sprinkler relocation as required. Scope captured hit print. Well, wait a minute. Who's responsible for that? How many sprinklers? Are they actually doing the work, or are they coordinating the work? The note really doesn't say, and it's really difficult for a contractor to put a price on that. So if the actual work is much more than the contractor priced, they're going to submit a change order for the actual work. They're right to do so since the original scope was not clearly defined. Another example, the plans show new sprinkler piping, but don't mention any demolition or removal of existing piping. It may be implied, but if demolition is listed nowhere in the documents, then it's not really the contractor's scope of work and not their responsibility. Last example, probably more delicate to handle, is the while you're at it type request. Work's begun and you're asked to do something extra, while you're at it. Maybe it's a storage room that wasn't originally in the plans, running a few iterations of hydraulics at the request of the owner, or expanding a report you're writing to include another scenario at the client's request. It can be hard to know where to draw the line. The good news is you usually don't have to make these decisions by yourself. You can always raise your hand to flag something, but typically the architect, project manager, or your supervisor is responsible for helping to determine scope creep. But understanding what the scope of work is going to help you recognize what is out of scope. In this segment, we talked all about scope of work, what it is, how to define it, and why it's important. The scope of work is clear direction about what is to be done, how it is to be done, and in what time frame. The drawings and specifications, they're instructions to the contractor to tell a story about their part in the project. They remove ambiguity and provide clear guidelines. Unclear scope leads to RFIs, change orders, finger pointing, and a lot of wasted time. And remember, scope of work includes a noun and a verb. And others, well, they're not on the payroll. I'm Jocelyn Sarantonio. This is MeyerFire University.
This has been a preview of MeyerFire University. Join the next generation of fire protection experts at www.meyerfireuniversity.com.